Today, we are diving deep into a Supreme Court case that all hinged on a simple promise, giving some much-needed tax relief to millions of Filipino workers. But, what happens when the fine print seems to take that promise away? Well, a legal battle kicks off, and it goes all the way to the top. This is the story of Republic Act 9504.
So let me start by asking you a question. Have you ever gotten a small pay raise only to look at your payslip and feel like your take-home pay actually got smaller? It sounds impossible, right? But it's a very real thing, and it was the exact problem that lawmakers back in 2008 were trying to fix. The technical term for this problem is bracket creep. You can think of it as this kind of invisible force. As your wages go up just a little bit, maybe to keep up with rising prices, you get bumped into a higher tax bracket. So what happens? You end up paying more in taxes, but your actual ability to buy things, your purchasing power, hasn't changed at all. You're basically getting taxed on inflation. And you can really see the problem when you look at the numbers. For a minimum wage earner in the National Capital Region, their tax burden back in 1997 was around 5.3%. Fast forward to 2008, after years of this bracket creep, and it had nearly doubled to 10%. I mean, the lowest paid workers in the country were losing more and more of their income to taxes every single year. Okay, so here's our game plan. We'll start with that tax trap, then look at the law's big promise, dissect the really controversial fine print, follow the whole showdown in court, break down the Supreme Court's decision, and finally get into why this ruling is still so important today.
All right, first up, let's talk about the government's solution. To fight back against this bracket creep, they passed a new law, Republic Act 9504, and it was designed to give workers immediate and pretty significant tax relief.
The promise of this law was, really straightforward and pretty powerful. First, it made minimum wage earners totally exempt from income tax on their basic pay, their overtime, all of it. And second, for everybody else, it seriously increased the personal and additional exemptions. That meant more money in every single taxpayer's pocket. It was a really, really big deal. And the intention of Congress couldn't have been clearer. I mean, just look at the sponsorship speech. This wasn't some boring technical tax adjustment. The courts have a term for this: social legislation. It's a law passed with a real sense of urgency, specifically to give immediate economic help to the people who needed it the most. So the law was passed, the promise was made, but then came the implementing rules from the Bureau of Internal Revenue, the BIR. And this, my friends, is where our story takes a very sharp and controversial turn. Now, the timeline here is absolutely key. The law officially took effect on July 6, 2008, but it wasn't until September, months later, that the BIR issued its own set of rules on how the law was actually going to work. And let's just say those rules had a few surprises inside. And this is where we see the two major conflicts. First, the law was clearly intended to give people tax relief for the entire year of 2008. But the BIR's rule, it said the benefits only applied from July 6th onward, just for half the year. Second, while the law gave a blanket tax exemption to minimum wage earners, the BIR created this thing called a disqualification trap. It said if an MWE got other benefits, like bonuses, over the legal limit, their entire income, including their minimum wage, would suddenly become taxable. So, as you can probably imagine, this did not go over well. A lot of people, including some of the actual senators who wrote the law, were furious. They saw these regulations as a complete betrayal of the law's intent, and that led to a major showdown in the Supreme Court. The arguments were pretty clear-cut. On one side, the petitioners were arguing for the spirit of the law, saying, hey, this was meant for the full year, and the exemption for minimum wage earners is absolute. On the other side, the government took a much stricter view. They argued the law could only apply from its effective date and that this disqualification rule was necessary to stop tax evasion. So, you've got the law on one side and the regulations on the other. It all comes down to this. How did the Supreme Court settle it? Well, spoiler alert, it was a pretty big victory for taxpayers. So first on the docket was that half-year rule. The court had to decide, was this tax relief for all of 2008 or was it just for the second half? And the court's ruling was a crystal clear yes for the taxpayers. It declared that all the new exemptions apply to the entire 2008 tax year, not just part of it. Their reasoning was actually pretty simple. They said, look, this is social legislation. It's meant to provide immediate help. And since the law was passed well before the tax filing deadline for that year, it only makes sense that its benefits were intended to be felt for the whole year.
Okay, so next up, the court turned its attention to the most controversial piece of the puzzle, the disqualification trap. Could getting a bonus really strip a minimum wage earner of that hard-won tax exemption?
And once again, the court's answer was a resounding no. The whole ruling really came down to a fundamental principle. An agency, like the BIR, well, it can implement a law, but it absolutely cannot rewrite it. The logic here was just so solid. Congress had set a really clear, simple definition for a minimum wage earner. There were no extra conditions. The BIR added one. So the court clarified, saying, yes, of course, benefits over the legal limit are taxable on their own. But that separate tax issue cannot reach back and cancel out the core tax exemption on a worker's minimum wage.
So this was a massive victory for taxpayers. But beyond the immediate refunds and the tax savings, what's the lasting impact of this case? Why does this decision still matter so much, even today?
Well, this case powerfully reaffirmed some really core principles of our entire legal system. It put down a marker that says administrative rules have to follow the law they implement. They can't add to it, subtract from it, or change its meaning. It also highlighted just how important legislative intent is, especially for laws that are meant to help people. And it was a perfect example of checks and balances in action, with the judiciary stepping in to correct an administrative overreach.
And that kind of leaves us with one last big thought. This ruling defended the promise that lawmakers made, and it made sure that relief for workers wasn't undone by some bureaucratic fine print. It really forces us to ask, how often does the true spirit of a law get lost in its implementation? This case is a permanent reminder for all of us to always read the fine print, but to never, ever forget the promise.